Now, an even bigger threat to China's stability in the 19th century, and what probably contributes the most to what's seen as the century of humiliation, is external pressures accompanying the internal problems that the Qing dynasty is facing. The corruption of the Qing dynasty, their failure to maintain the infrastructure and the bureaucracy of the country, as well as the uprising of the Taiping Rebellion, are massively destructive to the interior of China. But what humiliates the Chinese more than anything is external invasion and external defeat at the hands of Western states, right? And this all begins with what's known as the Opium Wars. So, for centuries, shoot, millennia even, there has always been a massive trade imbalance between China and the West. China has always had goods that the West desires, like silk, like gunpowder, like paper, etc. But there really have been few things that China has imported from the West. You know, we talked about this when Europeans begin to get involved in the Indian Ocean trade, that their goods are not very desirable in Asian markets because of the low quality and because of, you know, just simply the nature of goods. It's not until the globalization of silver where European powers actually begin having purchasing power in China and other Asian markets. But even with the globalization of silver, China is still a supplier economy. Westerners are still purchasing Chinese goods without having much to offer the Chinese in return, right? So in the 19th century, as the British expand their colonialism in India, they come across a drug known as opium. Right now, opium is produced from the poppy plant, which grows wildly in northern India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. And processing of this plant produces a powdery substance that creates a very euphoric feeling, similar to marijuana, but much, much stronger and much, much more addictive. In fact, opium is the active ingredient in heroin, right? So, as the British become introduced to this, they begin producing it in large amounts, and they begin introducing it into Chinese markets. And pretty soon, opium addiction within China becomes a nationwide problem. Millions upon millions of Chinese citizens become addicted to the drug. They use it to kill the pain of their long hours and the hard labor of, you know, subsistence farming. So much so that in the 1830s, the Chinese government formally addresses the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, asking her to put an end to the opium trade. And when British merchants refused to stop importing opium, the Qing dynasty quickly outlaws the substance and forces everything underground into a illegal black market, right? Now, as the Qing begin to enforce these anti-opium laws, they begin seizing and destroying any opium that they find. And the majority of this opium is the property of British merchants. And as they begin to destroy the property of British merchants, these British merchants appeal to their government. And what essentially happens is that the British government decides that their economic interests outweigh the desire of the Chinese to restrict opium in their country. And this leads to open war between the British and between the Chinese. Now, this first Opium War sees something that even 100 years earlier would have been unthinkable. And that is that a Western European state challenges and wins against the overwhelming might that is China, right? But thanks to the mechanization of warfare, things like the Maxim gun, things like repeating rifles, artillery, large bore cannon, these modern industrial weapons lead to a rather easy British victory. The British Navy sweeps the Chinese Navy out of the seas almost. And the end of the First Opium War in 1842 leads to what's known as the Treaty of Nanjing. And this is the first in what's known as the unequal treaties. And basically, this first treaty is rather tame. It requires that the Chinese no longer restrict the sale of opium and that they open 5 ports to Western, specifically British merchants and British goods. This gives the British a foothold in China that no Western state has had in 3,000 years, right? Now, the Qing, while they signed the treaty in order to put an end to the war, continue to resist the import of opium. And this leads to a second opium war in the 1850s. This opium war is far more destructive and far more widespread. It is yet again another massive British victory. The British actually invade and capture the Chinese capital in Beijing and desecrate the palace of the emperor. So this is essentially the beginning of the century of humiliation for the Chinese. A small, for most of history, inconsequential Western state has now twice completely overwhelmed the greatest Asian state that has ever existed, right? And their victory in this second Opium War emboldens the British, and they begin making serious demands of the Qing dynasty. First and foremost, they require the Qing to open China to Christian missionaries, right? They also force the Chinese to give them special trade status, essentially meaning that British goods are free from import tax, which makes them cheaper and more competitive with Chinese domestic goods. So this causes the Chinese economy to take a further hit. And it requires the Chinese to essentially hand over what's known as a sphere of influence to the British. And these spheres of influence are essentially become miniature colonies within China, where technically it is still part of Chinese territory and it is still Chinese land, but the British are allowed to settle and set up their own industries and their own businesses within Chinese land. They are exempt from Chinese law, so essentially they can do as they please as long as they don't upset British authorities and break British law. And within the next few decades, under the threat of military action, other Western states begin to follow the British example. They begin demanding and winning these unfair treaties from the Qing dynasty. And what begins happening is that China begins to be carved up into these spheres of influence, essentially colonizing China while not basically economically colonizing China without actually settling it. Okay. So China territorially and politically is still under the Qing dynasty. But what you have are these essentially trade zones where Western foreigners are essentially able to run wild, ignore Chinese law, um, buy and sell Chinese and foreign goods, including opium, as they wish. Now, this intensifies as we approach the 20th century, and the Western countries become more and more bold, carving out bigger and bigger pieces of China. Eventually, the exploitation of the Chinese and the Chinese markets becomes a bit of an international kind of mark of shame, and it's for a time slowed down by the United States, who creates what's known as the open door policy. And this is an agreement between the industrialized nations that they will try to adhere to Chinese law. They will refrain from forcing China into any more unfair treaties, that they will help support the stability of the Qing dynasty, because they realize if the Qing dynasty falls and the country erupts in a civil war, that's going to be bad for their business. So the Qing dynasty maintains its power, but it is completely dependent upon money and weapons from these Western industrialized nations to survive. And in return for those weapons and that money and that support, essentially, Western foreigners are allowed to run free across China. So this chart on the right gives you an idea of the massive scale of the opium business in China. So the British really begin to import opium on a large scale towards the beginning of the 1800s. And then once you have the Opium Wars begin, and the British can now freely bring opium in and out without harassment from Chinese authorities. I mean, essentially, opium becomes fair game all across China, and the addiction rates score, right? By 1832, you can see the British are bringing nearly 25,000 chests of opium a year, each chest weighing somewhere between 150 to 200 pounds. I mean, that is enough opium to keep an entire city high for weeks and weeks at a time, right? And opium addiction becomes again, like I said, a national crisis for the Chinese. So this map gives you an idea of what we're looking at in terms of these spheres of influence. The British, the French, the German, the Japanese, and the Russians all begin carving out large spheres of influence within China, essentially forcing them to suspend law in China and allow the Western states to do as they please economically. Now, the Qing, although they are dependent upon the West for funds and stability and essentially maintaining their empire, do recognize the need to resist Western influence. And they do recognize the need to begin modernizing their country based upon Western methods and Western technology. And this begins the period of what's known as self-strengthening. And this is a limited attempt by the Qing to begin modernizing certain areas of industry, to begin modernizing certain processes within the government in order to become more efficient. The Confucian exam system is done away with, but then brought back, but then modernized with Western techniques and Western philosophies and things like that. Um, Industrialization is embraced, at least on the level of heavy industries like shipbuilding and railroads and things like that. There is huge land and tax reform. The landlord class sees large amounts of its land seized from it and either used for government run industrialization or distributed to the peasant class. They begin paying much larger shares of taxes, similar to what you see in terms of the French Revolution, in terms of tax reform. And as the Qing begin to implement this self strengthening plan around the country, there is a heavy pushback, especially by the Chinese aristocracy, the landowning class, and the scholar gentry, the government officials. These are the people who have the most to lose, right? If the Confucianist exam system, which has been the standard of education for thousands of years in China is done away with, well, these scholar gentry, these government officials, will lose their special status. They'll lose their economic viability. They'll lose their place in society and essentially be disgraced because their way of life will have been replaced by this more westernized, modernized way of life. So there is a huge pushback from the upper classes. And essentially, the Qing self strengthening program, while it does help to modernize and industrialize certain industries, more importantly, what it does is it creates more anti Western sentiment within within China itself. Not that the Chinese people needed to dislike Westerners more based on the Opium Wars, but the self strengthening program to many people feels like capitulation. It feels like giving up and just simply turning the country over to the foreigners, right? Now, all of this anti Western, anti Qing sentiment comes to a head in the early 1900s in what's known as the Boxer Rebellion. And this is an anti Western, anti Qing rebellion in the capital of Beijing. It focuses on ridding the capital of foreigners and people who embrace foreign ways of life. Thousands of Chinese Christians are murdered, government officials, government police and soldiers are murdered, foreigners are murdered or expelled, and within a few weeks, 10 to 20,000 people in the capital are dead. So this is a massive crisis for not only the Qing but for these Western governments. And so very quickly, the Western governments respond in force, and a combined army of British, French, German, Japanese, Russian, and American troops land in China, invade the capital, and essentially put down the Boxer Rebellion very violently. And all of the Boxers within China are hunted down and executed by these Western armies. And the Boxer Rebellion signifies essentially the last the last gasp of Chinese resistance. This is the final this is the final demonstration. This is the final reach by the Chinese people to hold on to that traditional idea of the Middle Kingdom, that the ways of the West aren't necessary and that China is better and above them. Once the Boxer Rebellion is crushed, most people turn against the Qing. They see the Qing and their weakness as the problem, that the Qing have forsaken and betrayed the Chinese people. Um, Many calls for Chinese nationalism and the overthrow of the Qing begin around the country. The Qing are seen as outcasts and foreigners, which essentially they are. If you remember back to when we talked about the gunpowder empires, the Qing are not traditional Han Chinese. They are part of what's seen as these northern barbaric nomads, right? They come from Manchuria, they invade the Ming Dynasty, overthrow it, and establish themselves. Now, the Qing go on to adopt Chinese styles of dress and Confucian beliefs and Confucian exam systems, and they absorb the traditional Chinese way of life. But as the Qing dynasty grows weaker and the Westerners become more powerful and begin to run more rampant throughout China, the kind of traditionally ethnic Chinese begin to cast the Qing as these foreigners who have betrayed the Chinese people and are just simply willing to be slaves to the West. So this very ethnocentric Chinese nationalism begins to grow. And in 1911, there is a national revolution within China. The final Qing emperor abdicates the throne, and essentially China dissolves into anarchy. And you're going to see over the next 40 years a civil war between many different factions. The two biggest being the nationalists under Sun Yat sen and the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong, are going to fight for control over China over the next 4 decades. Not only are they fighting each other, but this civil war lasts through the beginning and the end of both World War One and World War Two. So not only are the nationalists and the communists fighting each other in the Civil War, but they're also having to fight Western powers. They're also fighting a Japanese invasion of China at the beginning of World War Two. So this is going to be an incredibly long, incredibly bloody, and incredibly destructive period for the Chinese people. And this is the culmination of their century of humiliation.